Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of January. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with Kupiansk and Liman frontline from this area. Today we have a lot of updates from this area, so let's start. And first let's take a look at the Russian sources map. When talking about the Kupiansk area, as you can see, the Russians, the front line is stable in this area. The Russians reported that as a result of the clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 40 soldiers and 70 around 2 armored vehicles. So the same number as we had yesterday, because yesterday the Ukrainians lost around the same number. So I won't be surprised if these 40 soldiers includes around 35 soldiers wounded and just 5 killed or something like this. Furthermore, the Russians reported that Ukrainians lost one commandos group in the area of Liman I. So this town is located in the gray zone. The Russians control Stavlazhanka, Vilshany, Gorbovka, and the Ukrainians, I believe, using the forest, using this area, were trying to understand, to find, to spot the Russians. So it was, I believe that when talking about this area, we are the witnesses of some kind of commandos duels of both sides of the Russians and the Ukrainians. And when talking about the previous 24 hours, we see that this duel was in Russian favor. Now let's move to the south, to Liman area. And when talking about this area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 5 commandos groups in this area. 5 commandos group, starting from Makeyevka to the forest that located on the north of Serebryanka in this area. Furthermore, as you can see, Dibrova still remains at the town in the green zone, because today the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the attack area in the vicinity of Dibrova. Furthermore, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours in Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost 150 soldiers and something around 11 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the losses on this front line are very high from the Ukrainian side. They lost 5 commandos groups, they lost a lot of soldiers, they're losing armored vehicles. And the main reason why we see this picture is that the Ukrainians, I believe that these days they try to storm Kryminaya, and there are just few ways to do this. The first one from the south using the forest, the second one through Dibrova using the fields, and the third one from the north using the forest as well. And of course, the clashes in forest are very high, are very difficult, and the reason is that why the Russians completely mine this territory, and the only possible way to get as close as possible to these towns is using your own feet. It is very difficult to use armored vehicles, tanks, or just regular cars to cross this area using cars. To tell the truth, I believe it's impossible. So this is the reason why the Ukrainians are forced to use their own feet, their own soldiers without armored vehicles to cross these territories. And from one side, in this case, their losses are very high because of mines, and the second one is because of the fact that they are not able to use vehicles. They are very slow. Just imagine yourself that using vehicles you're able to cross kilometers and dozens of miles, dozens of kilometers just in 15-20 minutes. And when talking about just regular infantry using this through this forest, you can cross the forest maybe like few kilometers per day. So it's completely different situation. And of course, the Russians have a lot of drones above these forests. They are trying to spot, to find the Ukrainians, and as soon as they find them, they start attacking them and shelling them with artillery. And when talking about the Ukrainians, of course, they are not able to evacuate or to escape because it's a forest. It's a very difficult situation. So this is the reason the losses of Ukrainians in this area are so high. And when talking about yesterday, they lost around 120 soldiers and lost 1 commandos. When talking the day before yesterday, and when talking about Liman, the Ukrainian lost around When talking about the 2nd of January, yes, they lost just 40 soldiers. When talking about the 1st of January, they lost around 150 soldiers. And all their losses are about the same, about the ground, about the forest, about the mines, and about artillery, and about the fact that they are not mobile and flexible in this area and completely unprotected. Furthermore, the Russians managed to destroy the Ukrainian ammo depot in the town by the name of Dibrova in this area. Furthermore, the Russians destroyed one howitzer D-20 in the area of Serebryanka as a result of effective artillery duels in this area. Now let's move to Bakhmut, Solidar area. As you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area. A lot of things happened during the previous 24 hours. And when talking about artillery duels, the Russians destroy another radar of counter artillery warfare, another radar. And furthermore, the Russians destroyed few artillery systems like Uragan and so on. But when talking about the situation on the ground, as you can see, there are two icons. The first one on the south in the area of Opetna, and the second one in the area of Solidar. And all these icons shows that the Russians developed their bridgehead. They managed to penetrate to make local penetration in these areas and to take more and to develop their positions, their bridgehead in these areas. Let's discuss these two blocks in more details because they're very important. When talking about Opetna, as you can see, the Russians finally crossed the residential area in Opetna itself. As you can see, they managed to establish control over these high buildings, and the last barrier that the Russians faced was this residential area in the south of Bakhmut, because this part of Bakhmut is Bakhmut. The area on the south of it is the town by the name of Opetna, some kind of suburbs, right? So it's completely two different towns. So we can say that the Russians have established final entire control over Opetna, and starting today they were storming, maybe not starting today, but these days they were storming the south part of Bakhmut. And as you can see, there is three high buildings in this area. They're very big. They're on the landfill, on the highland, and it was the best and very nice position from the Ukrainian side to control and to spot the Russian movements in the south. And the Ukrainians were using this area today. In the morning, the Russian sources published a video of these three buildings. When talking about the right building in the corner, this building was completely reduced to ruins, and like few floors were completely destroyed. There were just the low floors that on the always above the ground, like the first, the second, the third floors maybe survived, but the floors that located after the fifth were completely reduced. When talking about the buildings on the left side and the middle, I believe that they were like 50-50, not completely reduced. But anyway, I believe that Ukrainians were forced to step back from this position and they moved to the north of Bakhmut. This area is very important because of one important thing. If you take a look at this map, you're gonna see that these three buildings is the last high buildings in this area, and after these buildings there are no more high buildings in this area, and there is just a regular residential area with the small buildings. That means that the Russians are that means that the Ukrainians don't have any benefits from the ground in this area, and they're like on the same situation with the Russians. The only difference between the Russians and the Ukrainians is that Ukrainians on this front line is in defense state, and the Russians need to attack, and they need to cross the minefields, they need to cross some kind of traps and so on. But from the other side, the Russians have superiority in artillery, so of course I'm not sure who has more benefits in this case. But anyway, these three buildings were the last checkpoint that Ukrainians were able to use to freeze, to pin down, and to spot the Russians in this area. From now on, the Russians will be able to speed up and to move until this lake, I believe maybe in a week or in two, because there is no more barriers for these purposes. Now let's talk about Solidar. There are also very interesting updates. This morning we received the first update that Ukrainians 128th Mountain Assault Brigade were forced to step back from these positions. If you remember, the last week or maybe the 2 weeks ago, the same brigade, the same forces, the same battalions or groups of this brigade were forced to step back from these forests, from these brushes and these fields. And after that, the Russians reported about taking control over more and more checkpoints in this area. So today we saw the same picture on the south in town by the name of Bakhmutska, and the Ukrainians left the railroad station Dikonskaya. If you remember, we discussed this bridgehead many times. First, the Russians got control over this school, and after that, they started development their offensive operation in direction of this railroad station. And today, we receive update that Ukrainians were forced to step back from this area as well. Let's return to the Western sources map just to update for better understanding of situation in Solidar. This is Bakhmutska, this is the school we were talking about, and this is the railroad station that the Russians or got control today or just forced the Ukrainians to step back from this area, because it's two different situations. You understand that if the Ukrainians were forced to step back from this area, it doesn't mean that the Russians entered there. Maybe this area is completely reduced to ruins and there are no places where the Ukrainians can hide. A lot of different situations we can discuss, but for now, at least for now, we can mark this area, let's say, with the territory that more than 60 or 70 or 80% is under Russian control. So according to these updates, we understand that Ukrainians were forced to step back from this area. The Russians got control over they managed to develop their bridgehead in the south part of Solidar. Furthermore, the Russians have control over some brushes that located on the east from Yakovlivka. Yakovlivka itself under Russian control. There are a lot of updates and talks about Belogorovka. Some sources are saying that Belogorovka is not under Russian control. Some sources are saying that Belogorovka is completely, I will mark this territory as complete Russian control. Because even if it's not like this, I don't think that Ukrainians have control. That means that maybe this town is in the gray zone, but not under Ukrainian control at all. So this is the situation on the Solidar-Yakovlivka front line. As you can see, this situation is very critical for the Ukrainians in Solidar. At least the Russians are saying like that. But now, as soon as the Ukrainians were forced to step back from this railroad station, the Ukrainians tried to prepare their defense line along the railroad rockade and along this river. And so this is the Ukrainians' position, and this is exactly the area where the Ukrainians will try to stop or slow down the Russians. And to tell the truth, this is very powerful fortification. Very powerful fortification. This is Solidar itself. Let's return back to the Russian sources map. We're talking about this area. This is the railroad station, as you can see. This is the railroad station that moves to this industrial zone. It's not just industrial zone, it's mines, it's salt caves. It's a salt caves, and it's not just the salt caves. The Russian sources are saying that this is the biggest industrial area in the ex-Soviet Union. So it's the biggest in entire ex-Soviet Union territory, and it's not just a salt caves. It's a salt caves with developed network of underground passages. So all these territories, starting from, let's say, from this river Bakhmut till Solidar, maybe even to Krasnogora, there are a lot of underground passages that are located 100 meters above, under the ground. So it's a very powerful situation. We need to understand that during the previous months, the Ukrainians moved a lot of ammo, shells, a lot of necessary things they need to protect this area. All these depots located very underground, very far underground, and the regular Russian artillery systems or Russian missiles are not able to reach the depots that located in the ground, all these passages that located in the ground. So I believe that, and some sources are saying that this underground structure passages is much bigger and more developed than those one that we saw in Azovstal. If you remember, we talk a lot, and a lot of Western sources were talking about developed underground system in Azovstal, but the salt caves of Solidar is much more developed and much more bigger, and more and more and more about this situation. So it will be a very difficult task for the Russians to take control over this area. And to tell the truth, I'm not even sure if the Russians are able to do this, because but from the other side, we see that the Russians attack, and sometimes I think that the Russians attacks in this area just because they can, to take another square meters and so on. But of course, when talking about this area, by taking Bakhmutska, this railroad station, of course, now we see that there is an open gate for the Russians to develop their offensive operation in direction of Krasnaya Gora, in direction of Podgorodnya. These two towns, the Russians will. It's very likely that the Russians are able to take these towns. Furthermore, the Russians now are able to develop their bridgehead on the north of Solidar, not very far from their main position, just along these brushes. But anyway, they're able to establish some fire control, and maybe if they're lucky, if they will take their chance, maybe they are able to, by some luck, I don't know, by some case, to take control over towns that located on the west from Yakovlevka, and I'm talking about, let's say, Krasnopopovka or Mykolaievka, over this bridgehead. Of course, if the Russians are able to cross these fields somehow during upcoming during coming weather that we are going to see by the end of this week, of course, this situation might turn the entire situation on the ground very much. But for now, attacking direction of Solidar is not an easy job, and to tell the truth, I'm not even sure what the Russians are planning to do next. Maybe they want to block the Ukrainians in this area, and after that they will turn their focus in direction of Razdolovka, Veselye, and they will start pushing and pressing Seversk from the south, because we just discussed the situation near Kremenaya, the Ukrainians' attacks in this area, and there is a very big risk and chance that the Ukrainians are able to take Kremenaya under their control. Now let's, and when talking about Donetsk area itself, the losses are very high as usual on this front line. The Ukrainian lost around 100 soldiers and something, around 9 armored vehicles in this area. Now we're moving to Donetsk city, and today the Russians reported two very interesting updates. The first one, that as a result of artillery duels, counter battery warfare, the Russians managed to destroy another radar in Avdiivka, and today in the morning we got update that there was some clashes in the area between Krasnogorovka, Avdiivka and Kamyanka, in this area, somewhere in this area. We haven't received more updates about the situation. Maybe there was clashes between Ukrainians and the Russians commandos in this area, who knows. So for now, no more updates, but as you can see, the clashes are very close to Avdiivka, so maybe the Russians plans to do in this area something in this area as well. When talking about Peski, the situation is stable. The Russian pushes in direction of Pervomaiska. They're still doing clearing operation without any progress. When talking about Marinka, it's a grave. Marinka is a grave for both sides, for the Russians and for the Ukrainians as well. Today the Russians published some kind of radio talks between Polish soldiers who were sent in this area, and the Russians reported that around 120 soldiers, Polish volunteers, were sent to Marinka a few days ago, maybe a week ago, I don't know, but they're saying that by this morning just 28 soldiers from Polish volunteer group survived. The rest of the soldiers were killed, and a lot of those soldiers were killed under friendly fire from the Ukrainian side, from the Ukrainian snipers and so on. The situation there is very difficult. Those Polish soldiers were saying that it's very difficult to stand there because all this ground is full of dead bodies, and of course those dead bodies, smells not very good, so it's very difficult to stay there, to sleep there, because of all this situation, because of all this terrible situation. And so Marinka is a grave for both armies, and mainly for the Ukrainians, of course, because of the situation of artillery superiority. When talking about South Donetsk region today, we got a very interesting update from this situation. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 180 soldiers on this front line and something around 23 armored vehicles. So the number of armored vehicles is very high and the number of losses is very high. When we compare these numbers with the previous day, we see, let's say, when talking about yesterday, the Ukrainian lost just 30 soldiers, the day before yesterday 40 soldiers, the day before yesterday just 50 soldiers. So it's just the regular losses that we can see near Kupiansk, but when talking about previous 24 hours, the losses are very high. And these losses also shows about some kind of activation of the Russians on this front line. As you can see, now we receive more and more updates from Orekhov, Gulyai Polye front line. The Russians destroy another howitzer Gvozdika near Orekhov. The Russians destroy another warehouse in this area. The Russians destroy another group of Ukrainian army, convoys of Ukrainian vehicles. Furthermore, the Ukrainians made a few attempts of counter-offensive operation in direction from Gulyai Polye in direction of Dorozhnyanka, but all those attacks were repulsed. Furthermore, today there was some kind of prisoners exchange between in the same area near Vasilievka, but later, after the this exchange process finished, the Ukrainians using artillery system attacked Vasilievka, the town, like the first border town of the front line that people uses to understand where they're planning to move next. And the Russian sources are saying that as a result of that attack, a lot of people, civilians were killed and so on about this territory. Today, also, there was a very interesting interview of the head of Ukrainian intelligence, Budanov. He told a lot, he spoke a lot about the situation on the front line and so on. And he told us that the most important, the most difficult months in 2023 is March. He says that there are going to be very heavy clashes in March between two parties. There are going to be a lot of losses from both sides, and according to his words, March is going to determine the entire picture on the front lines on the territory of Ukraine. We can understand because March is already a spring, and both sides will be able to start offensive operation, and the Ukrainians and the Russians. Furthermore, when talking about the Ukrainians, I believe that maybe by March we're going to see how Lend-Lease is going to start working, and many other factors about the Ukraine and so on. So we'll see. But anyway, also according to his projection, tomorrow is the 5th of January, and according to the projection of the head of Ukrainian intelligence, tomorrow the Russians should start the global mobilization process on the territory of Ukraine. So we'll see. We'll see if we can believe this man, or maybe he's just another speculation system to speculate a lot of things on about the Ukraine and so on. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.